Hello, dear friends. This is Dr. Felipe from Human Life International. Together with my colleague, Adolfo, we will be talking to you about the history of the culture of death. This is the talk that follows the presentation that we did previously. So, when did the culture of death begin? Actually, the culture of death began with original sin. But in the last 2 centuries, it has become more perverse and pervasive. Original sin, ushered this new mentality of autonomy and individual freedom. So in the last 2 centuries, it has become more perverse and pervasive. So there's new forms of attack, abortion and euthanasia, a new mentality. Society believes individual freedom justifies them, so autonomy and individual freedom rule. New technologies make it possible to kill more innocent lives like IVF, in vitro fertilization. So let's go back a couple of centuries to the late 1700s. In 1789, English clergyman Thomas Robert Malthus, concerned about the origins of poverty, published an essay titled Essay on the Principle of Population. This was a time in history when the world's population had been increasing at a faster rate than in the past. Some were concerned about overpopulation. He proposed that population growth would eventually outstrip the growth of resources that were needed to support the increasing number of people. He was mostly concerned about food sources, that there would not be enough food to feed all these people that as the population was increasing. He deplored the large families of the poor. His idea was that the poor were poor because they had too many children, and that eventually the large population of the poor would eventually put a strain on the state and result in bankruptcy. About 50 years later, in 1859, Charles Darwin published his master work, The Origin of Species. Darwin is said to have been influenced by Malthus' writing. Darwin's theory of evolution reversed the Judeo-Christian doctrine of the fall of man from perfection. The Judeo-Christian doctrine of the fall of man from perfection. The fall of man from perfection was replaced because of his transgression, the transgression of the human person. It was replaced by a quest for perfection through a process that he described as natural selection. The process of natural selection would result in the survival of the strong and the fit, and the eventual elimination of the weaker individuals, the death of the weak and the unfit was essential for progress to be made. Death became an essential element in the human being's path to perfection. Death was necessary for making humanity better, for improving the lineage. The eugenics movement, offspring of Darwinism, developed in Europe by the late 1800s. So it's another 50 years forward. In Great Britain, Darwin's cousin, Sir Francis Galton, introduced eugenics as science. Eugenicists argued that many of the maladies of man were due to inferior inherited traits. The eugenicists encouraged the fit, middle, and upper classes to have families. The unfit, the poor, the immigrants, the minorities, they were to breed less. Influenced by Darwinian natural selection and the popular utilitarian philosophy of the time, the concept of a right to death surfaced in Europe toward the end of the 19th century. This concept of a right to die was widely debated in different circles. In Germany, in the year 1920, Karl Binding and Alfred Hoag published the manuscript allowing the destruction of life unworthy of life. Members of the intellectual elite, Binding was a prominent jurist, he was a judge, and Hoag was a professor of psychiatry. With the intent to benefit society, the authors advised taking the life of those whose life was devoid of value, those whose life was unworthy of life. Euthanasia was supported by the concepts of unworthy life and burden to society. The killing of the unfit was spoken in terms of compassion and release from suffering. The impetus for the program was medical economics. The publication of the manuscript was a landmark for the euthanasia program that was to follow. Advocates of euthanasia, few at first, gradually increased in number. Many were academics, professors at medical schools. The systematic organized killing began in the 1930s. It started with the killing of infants and children and congenital defects and mental retardation, followed by disabled and mentally ill adults and the terminally ill. Children and adults in psychiatric hospitals were killed by lethal injection. When this method proved costly and awkward, gas chambers were built in some hospitals and patients were transferred for extermination. Note that the first gas chambers in Germany were built in hospitals, not in the concentration camps. It is important to note that this program was the initiative of members of the German medical community. Nazi ideology simply embraced the eugenics and added some of their own. Many German physicians later accepted the Nazi racial doctrines. The atrocities committed by German doctors to inmates in the concentration camps are well known. Binding and Hoag, these two people, were respected scholars. They were academics. They were convinced their arguments to kill the sick and disabled were based on sound economics and supported by the law. The killing by physicians of those whose lives were considered unworthy occurred barely a decade after the publication of this manuscript. What about in this country, in the United States? In the early 20th century, the eugenics movement was embraced by the academic community. Funding for eugenics research was provided by the Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Ford Foundations. Faculty from Stanford, Yale, Harvard, and Princeton universities were active promoters. Compulsory sterilization of defectives was carried out in the United States. Forced sterilization laws were enacted in 27 states by 1909. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes endorsed the practice of sterilization of defectives in a 1927 United States Supreme Court decision. This was known as Buck versus Bell, 1927. Margaret Sanger, founder of the abortion industry organization Planned Parenthood, was a leader in the eugenics movement in the United States. The sterilization of the unfit, this so-called inferior person, was considered a benefit to society. This was happening in our country in the early 20th century, in the early 1900s. This affirmation was purportedly based on science and economics and ultimately the common good. The justification for the act based on compassion and release from suffering. So the disabled were felt to be suffering because of their disability. this actually is open to question, right?
Now we go into another component, namely Margaret Sanger and IPPF, International Planned Parenthood Federation. While all these things were occurring in Europe about the life considered to be unworthy of life, in the United States, anti-life activist Margaret Sanger proposed three major, very evil ideas: licentiousness, so-called free sex, birth control, including abortion, and we're talking about the beginning of the 19th century, of the 20th century, when both abortion and contraception were illegal in the United States, but she was then promoting them. And she also was an advocate, as Dr. Felipe rightly pointed out, of eugenics, and we can add to that racism. We shall see why. In 1916, Margaret Sanger opened the first birth control clinic in New York. For that, she spent 30 days in jail for violating the Comstock laws. These laws were the ones that prohibited the announcement or the propaganda, the sale, and the actual practice of contraception or birth control in the United States. But a judge made an exception for couples to contracept for so-called medical reasons. This opened the door for the future legalization and widespread practice of contraception. Continuing with the topic of Margaret Sanger and IPPF, in 1917, Margaret Sanger began the Birth Control Review, a magazine she directed until 1929. In this magazine, she promoted birth control, she promoted eugenics, and she promoted racism. And she was not the only writer, of course. She had a group of colleagues that contributed to the articles published in this review. In 1919, she established the Birth Control League. But because of the backlash against birth control tied to eugenics that people realized during the World War II, in 1942, Margaret Sanger changed the name of the Birth Control League to Planned Parenthood, the name that is held until today. Planned Parenthood, the major pro-abortion and pro-contraception and pro-sex education of the moral type in the United States. Then in 1954, along with other colleagues, she founded the International Planned Parenthood Federation that is widespread throughout the world. Sanger and her ilk, her collaborators, promoted eugenics through birth control. She advocated for the elimination of the so-called unfit and the promotion of the fit, including the Black population, in which she considered unfit. And her project concerning eliminating the Black population through sterilization and other means of birth control was called the Negro Project. Today, IPPF has its central office in London with affiliates worldwide. Its Western Hemisphere region office is located in New York with affiliates in all of the Americas. We're referring to the American continent and not just the United States. IPPF considers itself the world leader in birth control, including abortion. It is a federation of powerful and influential national non-governmental organizations that collaborate very closely with the United Nations and other anti-life international organizations. IPPF is, in fact, the largest anti-life and child perverter organization in the world. I say child perverter because through its sex education, it perverts the minds, hearts of minors, teens, and young adults. Because through this sex education, promoters of IPPF and also the UN promote abortion, contraception, fornication, homosexuality, the ideology of LGBT, etc., etc. We go now to talk about another component in the history of the culture of death and the culture of death itself, the United Nations. The United Nations was established in 1945 at the end of World War II. Its main objectives back then were maintaining international peace, establishing friendly and just relations among nations, and securing respect for fundamental human rights. It represented the triumphant democracies after World War II. But sadly, from the very beginning, the United Nations departed from these noble ideals. And one of the factors in this departure was a Nordic factor, the Scandinavian countries. From 1946 to 1961, in its key years of its ideological formation, leaders from Scandinavian countries occupied key positions in it. They represented the so-called third way between communism and capitalism, but they actually advocated for so-called democratic socialism. They had a new family model in which the state increasingly assumed parental roles. The state imposed sex education of the immoral type that promoted birth control and abortion, among other things. This ideology penetrated all United Nations bodies or agencies, including governments that collaborate with it. Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of the United States back in 1945 to 1948, and the USSR, the Soviet Union, were also factors in this departure of the United Nations from its noble ideals at the beginning. Roosevelt presided the UN Commission on Human Rights that drafted the list of human rights. Roosevelt was under the powerful influence of her friend Margaret Sanger. That's why she did not accept the life begins at conception in the first human right, which is the right to life, out of 30 human rights. The USSR, the Soviet Union, which had legalized abortion at the beginning of the 20th century, also denied or was against including the life begins at conception in that first human right. And it did so, or they did so, over the objections of Latin American countries, Lebanon, and the Philippines back then. Another component in this culture of death and its history was the contraceptive pill and the sexual revolution. In the 1950s, Sanger gave money to certain scientists to develop the contraceptive pill. This pill was tested in hundreds of poor Puerto Rican women. Many of them suffered serious complications because of it. Several pharmaceutical corporations decided it was, quote, end quote, safe for American women. In 1961, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, the agency of the government of the United States in charge of regulating the sale and production of pharmaceuticals and other things, approved its marketing of the contraceptive pill after intense lobbying from Planned Parenthood. In 1965, the Supreme Court of the United States approved it for married couples in Griswold versus Connecticut decision, overriding the Comstock laws that prohibited the use of contraceptives. Back then in 1930, going back a few decades, we need to contextualize this. The Anglican Church had approved contraception for married couples. This was the first time a Christian community of faith accepted contraception. In 1931, Pope Pius XI issued Casti Connubii, the encyclical on marriage, reiterating the church's condemnation of contraception as a response to the Anglican Church mistake or big error. In 1968, St. Paul VI followed that teaching in Humanae Vitae, on human life. But sadly, many Catholics, moralists, priests, and lay leaders dissented from this teaching. Today, sadly, very sadly, 90% of Catholic couples in the United States practice contraception. The contraceptive mentality has led to many evils: abortion, moral laxity, infidelity, etc., etc. The advent of the pill started a disastrous sexual revolution. Its worst evil has been the weakening of the moral fiber of the Christian West. The next component in the culture of death and its history is radical feminism. But at the beginning, the feminist movement had a very justified origin. It began towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. The original feminists promoted the right to vote for women, just conditions for work and salary, participation in society and politics. They also defend the right to life of unborn babies and consider abortion a crime against humanity, not condemning women who have fallen into this serious sin. We also, our hearts go out to them and invite them and everyone involved in abortion to repent, to conversion and healing. So we're fighting against ideas, against evil practices, not against people. God is infinitely merciful and wants to heal you and to forgive you, provided you repent sincerely. Well, the point is that the early feminists condemned abortion. Susan B. Anthony List was one of the key leaders at the beginning. Unfortunately, during the 1960s, the feminist movement made a 180-degree turn in its ideology. Pro-abortion feminist Betty Friedan published the book The Feminine Mystique, which was very influential. It did so in 1963. In this book, she criticized the idea that women could find realization only in the home. She promoted that they also should find that realization in the workforce and by being professionals. Nothing wrong with that. But the point is that she was radicalized in this idea, and so were her followers. So much so that for them, abortion and birth control would free women from motherhood, the home, and the natural family. Friedan also co-founded the National Organization for Women in the United States, NOW, or NOW for its acronym. It became the most ferocious feminist organization advocate for abortion and lesbianism. Continue with the topic of radical feminism. Nowadays, there are many international and national anti-life feminist organizations. For example, we have the United States-based International Women's Health Coalition. We also have in Latin America, the Latin American and the Caribbean Committee for the Defense of Women's Rights, CLADEM, for its Spanish acronym. We also have within the United Nations in recent years the establishment of United Nations Women, UN Women, which is really pro-abortion, pro-contraception, pro-radical feminism. We also have Catholics for Choice, which is a pro-abortion feminist group that pretends to be Catholic and that tries to confuse Catholics within the church, claiming that abortion, contraception, fornication, and other evils are acceptable provided conscience so decides. These people think wrongly that conscience is the one that decides what is right and what is wrong, when the one who decides that is God, and God has described his natural law in human nature and in conscience, which is a witness to that natural and universal moral law and not its source.